Hello cruel world, my name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. Valerie Bacot suffered from a lifetime of abuse at the hands of a husband who she eventually killed in March 2016 in France. Although she was technically found guilty of his murder, she was actually able to walk out free at court. So this happened fairly recently, a few weeks ago in June 2021. What abuse did Bacot suffer? What is battered woman syndrome? How is it used in a psychiatric defense? And why was it not used in this particular case? I'm going to answer all of these questions and many more in this video. Let's get started. So Bacot, who is now 40, described suffering abuse from her husband, Daniel Paulet, from the age of 12 when he was first her stepfather and then he became later her husband, which is pretty warped in itself, let's admit. It's not a good look to marry your stepdaughter or even your adopted daughter, Woody Allen, if you're watching. Paulet was 25 years older than Bacot, and he actually spent 2.5 years in jail for assaulting her in the 1990s, but amazingly he was allowed to return back to the family home. And then later he got her pregnant when she was 17. So to me this is just mind-blowing. There was such an obvious disregard for safeguarding issues, and I can't really speak to the French social care system, and also things weren't as regularly kind of regulated in the 90s. But in my opinion, it's absolutely unacceptable for an abuser to return to the same family home as the victim. Just doesn't make sense. Daniel Paulet reportedly began raping Bacot when she was just 12, and then he forced her to marry him and he fathered 4 children with her. When Bacot became pregnant, she was thrown out of her house by her alcoholic mother. So Paulet himself was quite a heavy drinker, and he attacked Bacot at one point with a hammer. He would frequently slap her, he would kick her, punch her and choke her. And Bacot in court described her life as extreme hell, which is fair enough. This is already a pretty shocking case, but I'm afraid to say that it gets worse. Paulet forced Bacot to work as a prostitute for truck drivers, and she would have to do this in the back of the family's minivan. And he would actually give her instructions through an earpiece that he made her wear, and they would charge between 20 and 50 euros per visit. And he also frequently threatened to kill her if she refused, and apparently he pointed his gun at her many times as a threat, and ironically it was the very same gun that she would later use to kill him. Personally, abuse in my career is very common, and even I see it in civil court cases as well as criminal court cases. So in criminal court cases I'm assessing the perpetrator, whereas in civil court cases I'm assessing the victim. And I've done cases where the claimant has suffered childhood sexual abuse, often because they're suing the social services or the school that should have protected them, because by the time I see them the perpetrator is either already dead, including a couple of cases of suicide, or they're in prison. And I have to say that this case of Daniel Paulet reportedly raping Bacot, so regularly from such a young age, it kind of makes my stomach churn, and it's probably more horrific than anything I've seen in my professional career. I think Paulet really is a poulet. So Bacot admitted killing her husband in March 2016 with his own gun that he kept in the car, and apparently she just fired a single bullet into the back of his neck whilst he was in the driver's seat. And this was actually during an incident when he was forcing her into prostitution, but she later said that she did it to protect her children, believing that her daughter, who was getting older, would be the next victim. So then Bacot hid the body with the help of her children in a forest and was arrested for this in October 2017, and then she confessed to the killing. Unsurprisingly, Bacot got a lot of support from the French public, and there were more than 250,000 people who signed a petition for her release. By the time of Bacot's trial, she'd already spent an entire year on remand in prison, and she was given a 4-year jail sentence with 3 years suspended, and therefore she was actually released in court because of the time that she'd already served. So for those of you that don't know, a suspended sentence is quite often misunderstood, I would say, and it's a bit complicated. So it's when the court poses a potential prison sentence, but the person is not immediately sent to custody. They're kept in the community for a specific delayed time, and that is to allow the offender to undergo probation and rehabilitation. So it's basically an alternative to short to medium term custodian sentences usually. So for example, if the perpetrator or the offender needs drug and alcohol rehabilitation, the court is giving them an opportunity to get this done before the time that they potentially could go to jail. And if they do, and if they can prove that to the court, then they don't end up going in prison. So the onus is on the defender defendant because they've got this potential prison sentence hanging over them, as opposed to, for example, somebody who's been released in jail and is on probation who might not particularly be that well motivated to stick to the conditions. Suspended sentences are supposed to be for relatively minor offences, and here in the UK they can only be for sentences that are in between 14 days to 2 years. So legally, if the equivalent case happened in the UK, this wouldn't have been applicable to Bacot's case because her sentence was longer. The defence lawyer in this case said this is an immense victory that a woman is going back to her children. Prosecution lawyer said it's important that Bacot was still convicted, but was also allowed to walk free. So I think he's just kind of talking about it's acceptable for her to have been convicted, but because of her circumstances, been let free as opposed to just being released. And he also said if people take justice into their own hands, then everybody is at war with everybody else. Personally, I think my boy Mahatma Gandhi said it better when he said, an eye for an eye and the whole world will go blind fighting. Nice one, Gandhi. Wise words, also a snazzy dresser. So 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐝's own sister said, the person I thank the most in the world is Valerie because she killed him. She did what I should have done a long time ago. So that's 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐝's own sister. So Bacot's case had similar kind of echoes of a case where another French woman named Jacqueline Sauvage was jailed for shooting dead her abusive husband in September 2012, which is the day after her son committed suicide. And there were suspicions that the father had been sexually abusing the children. So she received a sentence for 47 years, but she also received a pardon, a presidential pardon from the Prime Minister at that time, François Hollande, in December 2016, after serving 2 years of a 10-year sentence. And interestingly, it was the same legal team that worked on both of those cases. So just to be kind of clear, Jacqueline Sauvage was imprisoned by a judge and then later pardoned separately by the president, whereas Valerie Bacot was given a lenient sentence due to her circumstances, which I'll come to later. But because she'd already served time in prison, she was allowed to leave court that day. So neither of them were technically found innocent, which is an important technical point. So what is battered woman syndrome? It's not recognised as part of a defence in France, but it is in other countries, including the UK and the USA. What is it? It is a pattern of signs and symptoms displayed by a woman who suffered persistent violence from her partner, whether it's psychological, physical, or sexual. It's all about a man exerting their power and control over a woman without regards for her rights or feelings. It actually was in ICD-10, which is a diagnostic manual, but it's not in use in recent manuals like the further ICDs or the DSMs. Battered woman syndrome, it's not a legal defense in itself, but it can be used as like a diagnosis that can constitute other legal defenses, such as self-defense, provocation, not guilty by reason of insanity, which I've talked about in my other videos, and diminished responsibility, which I've also talked about in other videos. I'm ashamed to say that historically, violence against women was not only common, but it's actually been legal for most of humanity. In Roman times, a husband was permitted to use reasonable physical force, including blackening eyes or breaking the nose of his wife when he was disciplining her. And then the Old English principle of coverture meant that married women could not own property free from her husband, or they couldn't claim control of it. In fact, women themselves were seen as property. And to illustrate this, in Old English rape laws, if a rape occurred, then it was considered to be against the husband. So the husband was the victim or the father or the financial benefiter of the woman, because the male was the owner of the victim and was compensated for the damage to his property. And also marital rape was inconceivable for hundreds of years, as it was thought that women could not legally refuse their husband's sexual advances. And in fact, in many parts of Europe, a man could kill his wife without penalty into the 1600s. By contrast, a woman who went on to kill her husband was penalised as if she had committed treason, because the act of homicide was conceptualised as analogous to murdering the king back then. English common law sanctioned wife beating under the infamous rule of thumb law, which decreed that a man might use a rod not thicker than his thumb to chastise his wife. So that's where the term rule of thumb comes from. Ironically, that was actually supposed to be a law put in place for protecting the wives. American states adopted this rule in the early 19th century. By 1910, only 35 35 of the 46 states of America had passed legislation classifying wife beating as an assault. And in terms of recent changes, in the USA, it's only really in the last 15 years that most states have made it a crime for a man to rape his wife. Shockingly, some states require physical injury for it to be considered legally a rape. So battered woman syndrome was first researched extensively by Lenore E. Walker, who is an American psychologist who founded the Domestic Violence Institute. And she actually testified for O.J. Simpson during the trial of the murder and his ex-wife, Nicole Simpson. She was kind of chastised and judged by it because it felt that she was kind of stabbing the movement in the back by testifying positively on his behalf. Battered wife syndrome has occasionally been applied to men, and obviously it's rebranded and it's called battered person syndrome. In terms of diagnosing, it involves the following symptoms. It involves re-experiencing the battering as if it was recurring, attempts to avoid the psychological impact by avoiding people and situations that would cause it, hyperarousal and hypervigilance, which is like a constant background anxiety where you're easily startled by noises or sudden movements, etc. And also a disruption in the personal relationships and body distortion or other concerns about sort of sexuality and intimacy issues in the victim. So in terms of me conceptualizing this as a psychiatrist, I have to say it's very similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. So both of them, you have a reliving of this experience either in forms of flashbacks or in terms of nightmares, and you also have avoidance and you have hypervigilance. Although there are some differences, so in battered woman syndrome you get body image issues and sexual intimacy issues that you don't typically see in post-traumatic stress disorders. There are also other features of battered woman syndrome that are not diagnostic, but they are common, and they are kind of features that are common in domestic violence in general. And these are, for example, that the abuser thinks that it's their fault, and they often fear for their lives or the lives of loved one, typically children, and also they might have this kind of irrational belief that the abuser is omnipresent. The victim often blames themselves because they've not been able to change the situation, so it results in this kind of feeling of helplessness, so unsurprisingly is massively associated with depression. And often there's a lack of social support, so the victim feels isolated and lonely, and also just being cocooned away from the world intensifies the situations where abuse might occur. So I've had comments from viewers on other videos who've told me that they've been victims of abuse. If anybody out there watching this feels comfortable enough to share, either personally or what they've heard or what they've witnessed, then please let us know about your experiences in the comments below. So before I tell you about battered woman syndrome and how it's used as a legal defense, I want to quickly introduce you to this channel. This is a Psych for Sore Minds, your one-stop shop for information about mental illness and about offending. My name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. So I assess mentally disordered offenders in courts and in prisons and in secure psychiatric units. On this channel, I address a whole range of issues, some related purely to mental illness and some related to offending. I look at high-profile true crime cases and I give my own psychoanalysis. I talk about individual diagnoses. I interview some people. Basically, what I'm saying is there's something for everybody on this channel. Chiggity, check it out. So in terms of battered woman's syndrome as a legal defense, the first time it was used in a case was in 1977 in the United States for a lady called Francine Hughes, who used it in a trial where she had killed her husband who had been abusive. Unlike other countries, in the UK it can be used when violence has been accumulated rather than a single act. So in most other countries you have to prove that there was one huge act which the woman reacted reasonably and was provoked and lost control that can be understandable to everybody. But in the UK it doesn't have to be one huge act. It can be like at the end of her tether, the final straw that broke the donkey's back. So it could be proved that it was a series of potentially smaller incidents that led up to this one moment, if that makes sense. As I said, battered woman syndrome is not a legal defense in itself because it's a diagnosis, not a defense, but it can constitute other legal defenses. So provocation is the most common use, which was changed in English law in 2010 to loss of control. So loss of control, a bit like diminished responsibility, which I've talked about in other videos, changes the charge of murder to manslaughter, which is what diminished responsibility does. Except for diminished responsibility, the perpetrator has to have not known what they were doing or not known that it was legally wrong. Whereas loss of control, they did know what they're doing, but it was like a reaction to not being able to contain their impulsive actions because they've been provoked for so long. So in both cases, it downgrades to manslaughter. So if somebody has a murder charge, they have to have life imprisonment. The judge has no leeway, so they don't get to choose any other sentence. It has to be life imprisonment in UK law. Whereas manslaughter, it's at the judge's discretion what the sentence is. So it can be life imprisonment, it can be releasing the perpetrator, as in a situation like battered wife syndrome, or it can be anything in between. One of the main issues that needs to be sorted out is whether the jury accepts that the loss of control was reasonable for the average person. So for example, in Bacot's case, this was an extreme case, and it's very easy to decide, isn't it? I mean, I think it's fair to say that you or I, the average person, would say that she was provoked and it was reasonable given the severity of the abuse that she suffered. I think people would agree with that. But I've assessed cases where there's been like a co-violent kind of relationship, and the evidence suggests that the couple frequently fight and they both hurt each other, particularly in my clinical experience where both partners drink quite heavily. And so without witnessing the fights or having decent evidence, you only really have the account of the person that you're assessing. So it's difficult to actually know who was the provoker and who was the provokee. So my USP, I think, is that I sometimes discuss previous similar cases, although I anonymize the patients. But I have to say, in my experience, I've never seen battered woman syndrome as a psychiatric defense. Far more commonly, I've seen people who are victims of abuse get mitigating circumstances, but this diagnosis is not made. So in these kind of situations where there's a co-violent relationship, it's a grey area. So the jury would really have to look at the evidence from the woman and make sure that they believe that she was provoked enough in a way that a reasonable person would have acted in a similar manner. So to conclude, I'll tell you my final thoughts. I think it's absolutely fair that there should be a defense for vulnerable women, men and women, but let's face it, women are by far overrepresented as being victims of abuse. But at the same time, I also think that we need to be careful that the law is tight and that it's not manipulated. I'm glad that Bacot got her vindication, although she wasn't fully exonerated, but still she got to leave prison. But having said that, she did have to spend a year on prison on remand, which seems extremely unfair as she was the victim. But then the counter argument to that, I suppose, is it takes time. It might have taken a year to get all the evidence together. So I know that she was a victim, but in another set of circumstances, somebody else could have carried out an intentional and malicious killing of their husband. The perpetrator could have intentionally lied and claimed that they were the victim of abuse. And this needs to be proved. You can't just take their word on it because they could be dangerous. They could be a perpetrator of a woman. Whether that perpetrator's a man or woman, is dangerous for them not to be on remand and for them to be out for that period of time. Because you're a true crime fan, so you probably know there are a lot of people wandering around these streets who are potentially killers and who are potentially dangers to society. Dun dun dun. So please like this vid and share and subscribe. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it actually makes your windows gleam much more intensely. Before I go, I just want to tell you that I will be at CrimeCon UK, huge true crime convention, which is happening in London in September. You need to go cop your tickets. First time it's ever been in the UK. You will hear from law enforcement agents, victims of serious crime, and a whole host of podcasters and YouTubers. I will be doing my own talk about family members who have killed their own relatives. You got to come check it out. If you want 10% off, use the code PSYCH. All the details are in the descriptions of this video. Right, I'm done. Until next time, stay euthymic, and please remember, I love you.